It was a quiet evening after a long day. The director had just left the federal building after attending a late security briefing that went longer than expected. The streets were nearly empty as he drove toward the edge of the city, heading home to his small house just outside the busy center. He liked driving alone sometimes, without the usual convoy or security team. It helped him think, clear his head, and remind himself that underneath all the titles, he was still just a person. The night air felt calm, the kind of calm that follows a long day of tension. He rolled down the window a little, letting the cool breeze brush across his face. The radio played softly. Some old jazz tune he barely recognized, but it was enough to keep him company. The road was dark, lit only by the distant glow of streetlights that flickered between tall trees. He had spent most of his life working in law enforcement, believing deeply in fairness and justice. He had trained hundreds of agents and handled cases that tested the limits of trust and courage. But no matter how experienced he was, he never got used to how unpredictable life could be. That night, he didn't know that the next few minutes would test everything he believed in. As he turned onto a quieter road, he noticed headlights in his mirror. A police cruiser pulled up behind him. At first, he thought it was just coincidence. Maybe the officers were on their way somewhere else. But then the flashing red and blue lights came on. He frowned, wondering why they would be stopping him. He hadn't been speeding. His license plates were current. His turn signals worked fine. He slowed down and pulled to the side of the road, as he'd done countless times before in his career when traveling undercover or monitoring field operations. But this time was different. He wasn't in control. He was just another driver being pulled over in the middle of the night. He switched off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel, and waited. That's what he always told others to do. Stay calm, be respectful, don't make sudden movements. The flashing lights painted the inside of his car in waves of blue and red. A voice shouted from behind, firm but nervous. "Step out of the vehicle." He blinked, surprised by the tone. Usually an officer would approach and ask for license and registration first. He turned his head slightly, trying to make out the figure approaching. The light from the cruiser was too bright, making it hard to see. He took a slow breath, then answered calmly, "Officer, I'm with the Bureau." "May I show my identification?" "Step out of the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." The command came louder, sharper this time. He felt his stomach tighten. He'd seen this kind of tension before. Nervous officers acting on instinct more than information. Still, he followed instructions. He opened the door slowly, keeping both hands visible. The cool air hit him as he stepped out, the road quiet except for the hum of engines. "Turn around," another voice ordered. There were two of them now. Both young, both holding flashlights. The beams darted across his face, his jacket, his hands. One of them had his hand resting near his holster, a clear sign of unease. "I'm reaching into my pocket for my ID," he said in a steady voice, hoping they'd listen. "It's my Bureau identification card. Keep your hands where we can see them." One of the officers barked again. He froze. The weight of the moment pressed against him. He could feel his pulse quicken, but his training told him not to panic. He'd been in more dangerous situations before, but this one felt different because it was personal. He wasn't a suspect. He wasn't undercover. He was simply a man on his way home. "Sir," he tried again, keeping his tone measured, "I am the director of the Federal Bureau. Please allow me to show you my identification." There was hesitation. One of the officers glanced at the other, whispering something under his breath. The flashlight beams shook slightly, revealing the nervousness in their hands. "Do you have any weapons on you?" one asked. "No," he replied softly. "Only my ID." They told him to place his hands on the hood of his car. He obeyed without argument, feeling the metal cold against his palms. The situation had already gone too far, but he knew better than to escalate it. The street was empty, and he didn't want to be the reason it turned into something worse. The officers moved cautiously, checking his jacket pockets and patting him down. When one reached the inside pocket and found the leather badge case, he pulled it out quickly. The flashlight beam hit the golden emblem. The silence that followed was heavy. The young officer's eyes widened slightly as he realized what he was holding. The other one leaned closer, squinting at the ID card. A look of disbelief crossed his face. "Sir, I didn't realize." The first one stammered. He took a step back and rubbed his wrist gently, feeling the chill that had settled deep inside. "You didn't ask," he said quietly. The officers exchanged awkward glances. One of them muttered an apology, but it sounded uncertain, like someone trying to patch a crack that had already spread too far. He didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing slowly, trying to calm the rush of emotions that filled him. Embarrassment, frustration, disbelief. He knew mistakes happened. He'd spent years investigating them, but this one carried something deeper, a weight that words couldn't fix. He had followed every rule, spoken calmly, done everything right, yet still found himself standing on the side of the road under flashing lights, treated like a threat. When they finally let him go, the officer's tone had shifted completely. They called him sir now, offering forced smiles and stilted small talk. They explained that his car matched the description of one used in a recent robbery. He nodded without arguing, though he knew it was just a cover to soften what had happened. As he sat back inside his car, closing the door, he stared at the steering wheel for a long moment. The radio was still playing faintly, the same quiet jazz tune. The normalcy of it felt almost absurd. He rubbed his temples and exhaled slowly, trying to let the tension slip away, but it clung to him like a shadow. He started the engine and drove off slowly. The night had lost its peace. Every flash of light, every sound in the distance made him tense again. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, seeing not the confident leader everyone knew, but a tired man caught off guard by the system he'd spent his life serving. Halfway home, he pulled over again, not because he had to, but because he needed a moment. He parked by the side of a quiet park and sat there, listening to the soft hum of the engine. His hand still trembled slightly. He thought about calling someone from his team, maybe his deputy or his assistant, but decided against it. How could he even begin to explain what had just happened? Instead, he reached for his phone and opened the voice recorder. It was a habit he'd picked up years ago, to document things before they faded from memory. He spoke softly, describing every detail while it was still clear in his mind. The flashing lights, the tone of command, the cold metal of the car hood, the shock on the officers' faces when they realized who he was. When he finished, he sat back and closed his eyes. He told himself it was over, that it would fade with time. But deep down, he knew better. Something about that moment had left a mark. He had spent his entire career believing that authority and integrity could shield a person from injustice. That night, he realized how fragile that belief really was. The rest of the drive felt longer than usual. Each passing streetlight seemed to blink slower, stretching time. When he finally reached his house, the clock on the dashboard showed it was nearly midnight. He parked carefully, turned off the car, and just sat there for another minute. The silence around him was heavy, almost too quiet. Inside his home, everything was neat, untouched, just the way he had left it in the morning. He poured himself a glass of water, sat at the small kitchen table, and stared at nothing in particular. His badge lay beside the glass, shining under the dim light. For years, that badge had been a symbol of trust and protection. Tonight, it felt like a reminder of how quickly trust could be tested. He replayed the scene in his head again and again, searching for something he could have done differently. But the truth was, he hadn't done anything wrong. He had followed the same advice he gave to others. Stay calm, stay polite, stay alive. Yet somehow it hadn't been enough. Before going to bed, he checked his phone again. A few messages from colleagues blinked on the screen, but he ignored them. He wasn't ready to talk, not yet. He needed time to understand what the night had taken from him, something invisible but real. As he finally lay down, he thought about the young officers. He wondered if they realized what they had done, not just to him, but to the idea of fairness they had sworn to uphold. Maybe they didn't mean harm. Maybe they were just afraid. But fear, he knew, was a dangerous thing when it guided authority. Sleep came slowly. The flashing lights of the patrol car still danced in his memory, mixing with the sound of his own heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, faint and fading. He closed his eyes and tried to let it go, unaware that the events of that night would follow him far beyond the road where it began. The morning after the stop, he woke up earlier than usual. Sleep had been light and uneasy, broken by flashes of red and blue that kept replaying in his mind. He sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, staring at the faint morning light pushing through the curtains. It should have been just another day, but something about the air felt heavier than normal. He went through his usual routine. Coffee, a quick scan of the news, a glance at his phone, but everything felt different. His mind wasn't focused on work. Every sip of coffee reminded him of the night before, every quiet moment filled with what-ifs. For years he had told others that truth and integrity would always win, but now he wondered if he still believed that. When he arrived at the office, the security guards at the entrance greeted him as they always did. He forced a polite smile, nodded, and walked toward the elevators. He could feel their eyes linger a little longer than usual. Word traveled fast in that building. He wasn't sure how much they knew, but rumors had a way of finding their path. Upstairs, the atmosphere was tense. His deputy followed him into his office carrying a folder and a worried look. "We heard something happened last night," the deputy said quietly. "Are you all right?" He nodded. "I'm fine," he said, though it wasn't entirely true. He gave a brief account of what had happened, leaving out the emotion and focusing only on facts. The deputy listened carefully, face tightening with every detail. "We should report this," he said. "It's serious." "I already filed an internal note," he replied. "But keep it quiet for now. I don't want it turning into something else." The deputy agreed, though uneasily. As soon as he left, the director sat back and let out a slow breath. He could already sense the coming storm, the mix of concern, gossip, and quiet judgment that always followed anything unusual involving leadership. He had seen it happen to others, and now it was his turn to stand in that uncomfortable light. By noon, calls began coming in. A few colleagues wanted to check on him. Some were genuinely worried. Others were curious. Each conversation ended the same way. Polite words, awkward silence, then the familiar phrase, "You handled it well." He didn't feel like he had handled anything well. He had just survived the moment. Later that afternoon, a meeting was scheduled with officials from the Department of Justice. They wanted to review the incident. It was supposed to be routine, but he knew better. Nothing was ever routine when the upper levels of government got involved. He prepared a clear report, detailed but calm, hoping it would end the matter quickly. In the meeting, he sat across from 3 officials and a legal advisor. They asked questions in a tone that was careful but cold. How fast was he driving? Did he identify himself immediately? Did he raise his voice? Every word seemed to dig for something that wasn't there, a reason to share the blame. He answered calmly, keeping his composure. But inside, he felt a quiet frustration growing. "Do you believe the officers acted out of bias?" one of them asked. He paused before answering. "I believe they acted out of fear," he said finally. But fear and bias are often close. The room went still. The officials exchanged looks, writing notes in silence. The advisor cleared his throat and said, "Thank you for your honesty. We'll follow up if needed." That phrase, "if needed," echoed in his head as he left the room. He knew what it meant. It meant the issue might quietly disappear if it became inconvenient to pursue. He had seen too many cases buried under that same phrase. Back in his office, he sat by the window, looking out at the busy street below. People moved in and out of buildings, going about their lives as if the world were simple. He envied that. The phone buzzed on his desk. It was a message from his assistant. Media asking questions about the traffic stop. Should I respond? He froze for a moment. He hadn't told anyone outside the bureau about the incident. "No statement yet," he replied. But deep down, he knew this was the start of something larger. By evening, the story began to leak. A short post appeared online. Senior federal official detained by local police during traffic stop. It didn't mention names, but it didn't have to. Within hours, the story spread, with journalists connecting dots and filling in details. Calls flooded the communications office, demanding comments. He watched the coverage unfold quietly, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and resignation. He had always been careful, always measured in his public image. Now his name was trending alongside words like profiling and overreaction. None of it was under his control anymore. That night, he received a call from an old friend who worked in public relations. "You should get ahead of this," the friend advised. "Tell your side before others tell it for you." He hesitated. "I don't want to make it political," he said. "It's already political," the friend replied gently, "whether you speak or not." After hanging up, he sat alone in his office, the building nearly empty. The hum of the air system was the only sound. He thought about all the people who looked up to him, agents, analysts, trainees. What would they think if they saw him now? uncertain and shaken by a roadside encounter that should never have happened. He opened the small notebook he always kept in his drawer and began to write. Not for official record this time, but for himself. He wrote about the silence between commands, about how quickly respect turned to suspicion, about the cold air that still lingered in his chest. Writing it down helped him breathe again. In the following days, things escalated quickly. Reporters camped outside the bureau entrance. Commentators debated what had really happened. Some defended him, saying no one should be treated that way. Others claimed he had used his position to draw attention. He stayed quiet, refusing to be pulled into the noise. Inside the bureau, the atmosphere shifted. Conversation stopped when he walked by. Meetings became shorter, more formal. A few colleagues avoided eye contact altogether. The sense of camaraderie that once filled the halls now felt fragile. He had become a subject rather than a leader, a reminder of something everyone wanted to avoid discussing. One morning, he received an invitation to meet with the Attorney General. The message was brief and gave no reason. He knew it wasn't a social call. He prepared himself, straightened his tie, and walked to the neighboring building. The meeting room was large and quiet, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The Attorney General greeted him with practiced politeness. "I wanted to express my concern," she began. "We understand the situation has been difficult." He nodded, waiting for what came next. "There's a lot of public attention right now," she continued. "We need to ensure that the Bureau stays above controversy. I trust you understand the position we're in." He did understand, maybe too well. "Are you saying I should apologize for what happened?" he asked softly. "I'm saying we need to de-escalate," she replied. "Sometimes that means stepping back." He didn't argue. He simply nodded again, though the words left a bitter taste. On his way out, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in a framed glass panel. Tired eyes, tense jaw, the look of someone trying to hold on to calm while everything around him shifted. Back at his office, he decided to take a brief leave, officially for rest but really to think. His staff seemed relieved, though they tried to hide it. Before leaving, he gathered his team and thanked them for their support. He told them to stay focused, to keep their integrity no matter what happened next. His voice wavered slightly, but he managed a small smile. When he finally stepped out of the building, the evening sun was low, casting long shadows across the steps. The air felt cooler than usual, and for a brief moment he closed his eyes, trying to remember what peace felt like. Cameras flashed from across the street, but he didn't flinch. He walked calmly to his car, determined not to let anyone see the weight he carried. That night at home, he sat in silence for a long time. His phone buzzed again with messages from reporters and colleagues, but he ignored them. He turned it off and set it aside. The quiet room felt safe, but it also felt lonely. He poured himself another cup of coffee, even though it was late, and stared at the wall, lost in thought. He wondered how things had gotten so complicated so quickly. All he had wanted was fairness, not just for himself, but for everyone. Yet now fairness seemed like an idea slipping further away. Still, deep inside he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. Something had to change, even if it came at a cost. He looked out the window one last time before bed. The city lights blinked softly in the distance. Somewhere out there, the officers who had stopped him were probably back on patrol, unaware of the storm that had followed. He hoped they learned something from that night, just as he was still learning, about trust, about fear, and about how even those in power could be made to feel powerless. He turned off the light and sat quietly in the dark, the weight of his thoughts heavy but clear. Tomorrow, he promised himself, he would begin to decide what to do next. What he didn't yet know was that the days ahead would bring far more than decisions. They would bring consequences. The following week started with noise, the kind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. News outlets ran the story again and again, each with a slightly different angle. Some called it a misunderstanding. Others called it an example of unfair treatment. His face appeared on screens across the country, the headlines bold and dramatic. The situation had left the quiet walls of his office and entered living rooms, coffee shops, and social feeds. He watched the coverage for only a few minutes before turning off the television. It was strange seeing strangers argue about something that had happened to him, as if they knew every detail. Some people defended him, saying he had been disrespected despite his rank. Others claimed he was trying to use his power for sympathy. The truth, as always, sat quietly somewhere in between, ignored by those shouting the loudest. Outside the bureau, protesters began to gather, not for him personally, but for what his story had come to represent. Signs with messages about fairness, justice, and accountability appeared on the sidewalks. People wanted change, and his name had become part of that demand. He hadn't asked for it, but now he was in the middle of something much larger than himself. Inside the building, the mood grew uneasy. Every agent, analyst, and staff member had seen the headlines. Some offered supportive nods in the hallway. Others avoided his gaze altogether. He could feel the uncertainty around him, as if his presence alone carried the weight of controversy. He understood why. People were afraid to be associated with a story that was spiraling out of control. That afternoon, he was called into a meeting with the communications team. They looked exhausted, surrounded by papers and laptops filled with statements that all sounded the same. "We need to release an official comment," one of them said. "The public pressure is growing." He leaned forward and rubbed his forehead. "What are they saying?" "That we either stand by you or we don't," someone replied. "There's no in-between anymore," he sighed. "Then we tell the truth," he said simply. "I was pulled over. I identified myself. I was treated unfairly. I stayed calm. That's all there is." "But that's not how it'll be heard," one of them said. "People will twist it. They'll say you're making it about yourself." He nodded. "They'll say whatever they want," he replied quietly. But silence won't fix it. The room fell quiet. After a moment, the head of communications said softly, "We'll draft something neutral." He agreed, though part of him knew neutrality rarely satisfied anyone. Later that evening, the statement went out. It was short and careful, confirming the incident but offering no opinion. It said the matter was being reviewed and that the Bureau maintained respect for all law enforcement partners. It was safe, polite, and empty. Within minutes, social media exploded again, accusing the Bureau of trying to protect its image rather than seek truth. He closed his laptop and walked away from the noise. He stepped outside into the cool air and stood on the steps of the building, looking out at the small crowd of reporters waiting behind barriers. Their cameras were pointed toward the entrance, their microphones ready. He had faced tougher interrogations in his career, but this was different. This wasn't about policy or evidence. It was about perception, something far harder to control. A familiar reporter shouted his name, asking if he believed he had been targeted unfairly. He didn't answer. He just turned and went back inside. The question lingered in the air, echoing louder in his own mind than it had in the street. That night he sat alone in his living room again, the television muted. He scrolled through messages from colleagues, friends, and strangers. Some messages were kind, others harsh. A few simply said they were disappointed, without explaining why. He couldn't blame them. People wanted heroes to be perfect, and when they saw one caught in a moment of vulnerability, it unsettled them. In the days that followed, his private life became public conversation. News anchors debated his tone during the stop, his decisions, even his facial expressions in old photos. Former officials he had once worked with appeared on talk shows, giving their opinions about his leadership under pressure. Each word chipped away at his reputation, not through truth but through repetition. One morning, his assistant entered the office with a concerned look. "Someone leaked the footage," she said quietly. He looked up sharply. "Footage?" "The video from that night. The one people recorded." He stood slowly. "Where is it now?" "Everywhere," she said. "It's viral." He opened his laptop and searched. There it was. Shaky cell phone footage showing him standing beside his car, hands raised, calm but clearly uncomfortable. The clip wasn't violent or graphic, but it was powerful. It showed the confusion, the imbalance, the quiet humiliation of being treated as less than who he was. And now the entire country could see it. For a moment, he didn't know how to feel. The truth was out there unfiltered, but it was also being consumed like entertainment. Commentators played it in loops, slowing it down, adding dramatic headlines. People online argued endlessly about what the video proved. Some said it showed strength and restraint. Others claimed it showed arrogance. He turned off the screen. The truth wasn't supposed to be a debate, yet that's what it had become. Calls started coming in again. Journalists, politicians, advocacy groups. Everyone wanted a statement, an interview, a reaction. He declined them all. He needed time to think, to breathe. But time was the one thing he didn't have anymore. The story had taken on a life of its own. That evening, he received a message from a young agent who had joined the bureau just months earlier. It read, "Sir, I just wanted to say I joined because I believed people like you were proof that fairness still mattered. Please don't let this change that." He read the message twice, then a third time. It touched something deep inside him. It reminded him of why he had chosen this career in the first place. Well, not for power, but for purpose. He couldn't control what others said, but he could still control who he was. The next day, he called a small press conference. The communications team tried to talk him out of it, saying it might make things worse. But he had made up his mind. He needed to speak, not for damage control, but for clarity. When he stepped up to the podium, the cameras flashed again. He looked calm, though his heart beat faster than usual. "I want to thank those who have reached out in support," he began. "And I want to make something clear. I don't stand here as a victim or a symbol. I stand here as someone who believes in accountability. For everyone." He paused, letting the words settle. "What happened to me was not just about me. It was about trust, fear, and the need to see each other as people before positions. I have worked with officers across this country who serve with courage and compassion. I believe in them. But I also believe that fairness isn't something we can take for granted. It's something we have to protect." The room was silent when he finished. Reporters shouted questions, but he stepped away without answering. The statement wasn't meant for headlines. It was meant for conscience. That night, the clip of his speech spread quickly. Some praised him for his calm and honesty. Others accused him of being too political. But for the first time in days, he didn't care what people thought. He had said what he needed to say. At home, he sat by the window again, looking out at the dark sky. The storm outside had quieted a little, but he knew it wasn't over. There would be more questions, more opinions, more noise. Still, he felt lighter than before. He had spoken the truth, simply, clearly, without anger. He poured a glass of water and leaned back in his chair. In the quiet, he thought about all the people who had faced worse, whose stories had never reached the news. Maybe, he thought, this moment could still mean something good if it pushed even one person to look a little closer, listen a little better, and act a little fairer. The night grew still again. He turned off the lights, leaving the glow of the city to fill the room. The world outside was still noisy, still divided, but inside he felt a small peace return. It wasn't victory, but it was a beginning, the first step toward whatever came next. The days that followed felt heavier than before. Every morning when he stepped outside his house, the same quiet tension filled the air. Neighbors who used to wave now gave cautious smiles, unsure what to say. The mail piled up with letters, some supportive, some angry, some simply curious. He had become a symbol, but not the kind anyone wanted to be. At the bureau, the silence grew louder. The leadership team avoided his floor unless absolutely necessary. Meetings that once included him were suddenly rescheduled without notice. Memos were sent that didn't copy his name anymore. It was a quiet distancing, the kind that said more than words ever could. He understood it well. He had seen the same thing happen to others caught in controversy. Now it was his turn to feel the cold edge of isolation. One morning, while reviewing a report, he received a message from the Office of Professional Responsibility. They wanted to review certain aspects of recent events. The words were formal, but he could read between the lines. They were investigating him. For what, he wasn't sure. Maybe his actions that night, maybe his response afterward, or maybe just because someone needed to take the blame. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, letting the weight of it sink in. He called his deputy in. "They've opened an internal review," he said quietly. The deputy frowned. "On what grounds?" They didn't say. "But it's clear what's happening." He paused. "They want to show the public they're being responsible." The deputy hesitated before speaking. "Do you want me to reach out to the Inspector General?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "That would only make it worse. Let's stay calm," but staying calm wasn't easy. Every hallway conversation felt like it stopped when he walked by. The people he had mentored for years now looked at him with quiet sympathy or worse, fear. He couldn't blame them. In government circles, proximity to controversy could end a career faster than a mistake ever could. At home, he tried to escape the noise. He cooked simple meals, read old novels, and took long walks in the evening. But peace never stayed long. The phone buzzed constantly. Calls from reporters, old friends, advocacy groups. Everyone had an opinion, everyone had advice. He started turning it off entirely. The silence, though uneasy, was better than the endless noise. One evening, while sitting on his porch, his old friend from public relations called again. "You're losing control of the story," the friend said softly. "If you stay silent, others will keep shaping your image for you," he sighed. "It's not about the story anymore. It's about survival. But you can't just disappear," the friend insisted. "People still listen to you." "Not for long," he said, his voice quiet. "People don't defend what makes them uncomfortable." There was a long pause on the other end before the friend spoke again. "You've spent your whole life fighting for fairness. Don't let this make you give up on it." He didn't answer. The words lingered, echoing in the quiet of the night after the call ended. The next day he went to the bureau one last time before his official leave ended. The halls felt unfamiliar now, colder, emptier. A few employees nodded politely, but most kept their eyes on their screens. He stopped by the operations center where a small group of analysts worked quietly. They looked up when he entered, surprised but respectful. "Just checking in," he said with a faint smile. "Carry on." Before leaving, he walked through the lobby, taking in the seal on the marble floor, the one he had stepped over 1,000 times before. For years it had symbolized pride and purpose. Now it felt like a memory, something he belonged to once but wasn't sure he still did. As he stepped outside, a cluster of reporters waited across the street, cameras ready. He didn't speak. He simply nodded once and got into his car. The cameras clicked rapidly, capturing his silence more than any statement ever could. At home that evening, he opened his laptop to check his email. Among the usual messages was one from the Attorney General's office. The subject line read, "Request for discussion." It was scheduled for the following week. He stared at the screen for a long time before closing it again. He knew what discussion meant. It was never just a conversation. The following days were quiet but restless. He spent time rereading his notes from the night of the incident, trying to make sense of how it had all spiraled so quickly. Each line felt heavier now, filled with details that once seemed small but had somehow become enormous. He realized that truth didn't always protect you. It only made your fall more visible. When the meeting day came, he dressed carefully. The morning air was crisp and the city buzzed with its usual rhythm. He walked through the government complex, noticing how security guards and staffers greeted him politely but with an unfamiliar stiffness. He was no longer just the director. He was the man from the story. Inside the conference room, the Attorney General and a few senior advisors sat waiting. They exchanged formal greetings, the kind that came before uncomfortable news. "Thank you for coming," she began. "I know this situation has been difficult for everyone involved." He nodded silently. She continued, "We've reviewed the matter internally, and while no official misconduct has been found, the level of public attention is affecting the Bureau's operations." "I understand," he said evenly. "You want to protect the institution?" "Yes," she replied, her tone soft but firm. "And to do that, we believe a leadership transition might be necessary." For a moment, he didn't move. He looked down at his hands, then back up. "You mean my resignation?" he said quietly. The room was silent. One of the advisors shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The Attorney General finally nodded. "It would be the most dignified way forward, for you and for the Bureau." He exhaled slowly, feeling the words settle in his chest like a weight he had already been carrying. "When do you want it?" "By the end of the week," she said. He nodded once, stood up, and extended his hand. "Then let's make it clean." As he walked out of the room, he felt strangely calm. There was no anger, no shock, just a deep tiredness. He had spent decades protecting truth, only to find that perception could erase it in an instant. Outside, the hallway seemed longer than usual, and each step echoed like a reminder that this chapter was ending. That night, he sat at his desk at home, the resignation letter half finished on the screen. He stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before typing the final sentence. "I leave this position with gratitude for those who serve with honor, and with hope that fairness will still matter when the noise fades." He read it twice, then saved the file. The next morning, he printed it out, signed it, and placed it in an envelope. He didn't deliver it yet. He wanted one more day to think, not about his career, but about what came next. He took a walk through the park that afternoon. The air was clear and leaves rustled gently in the breeze. A few people recognized him, some nodding respectfully, others just watching. He smiled politely, though inside he felt a quiet ache. Leadership had always been about responsibility, not fame, and now he saw the cost of both more clearly than ever. As the sun began to set, he sat on a bench overlooking the water. For the first time in weeks, he felt something close to peace. The world was still noisy, still messy, but out here, away from the cameras and screens, it felt real again. When he returned home, he placed the resignation letter on the table by the door. The next day, he would deliver it, not out of defeat, but because he knew it was time to step back and let the storm pass. What mattered now wasn't the title or the office, it was what he would do after the noise was gone. That night, as he turned off the lights, he took one last look around the quiet room. It felt empty but not lonely. He whispered softly to himself, "This isn't the end, it's just another truth to face." And for the first time in a long while, he slept without dreams. The morning after he submitted his resignation, the sky was gray and heavy, as if even the weather knew what had happened. He woke earlier than usual, not because he had anywhere to be, but because his body was used to structure. For the first time in years, he didn't have a schedule waiting for him. No briefings, no calls, no reports, just silence. He made coffee and sat by the window watching the street outside. Life went on as usual. Neighbors leaving for work, buses rolling by, children laughing on their way to school. The world didn't pause for him, and that was both comforting and painful. He had spent so long believing his role mattered deeply to the rhythm of the nation. Now it felt like he had been quietly replaced by the next news story. The television was on in the background, the volume low. His resignation was the lead segment. The anchor spoke in the same measured tone used for every big story. After weeks of public pressure and growing scrutiny, the Bureau's director has stepped down from his position. The official statement thanked him for his years of service. His picture appeared on the screen, formal, distant, familiar. The words felt like they were describing someone else. He turned off the TV. There was nothing more to learn there. Instead, he walked into his study and looked around at the shelves of books, awards, and framed photos from years of service. Each one represented a moment of pride, a step in a journey he had thought would end differently. But now they just felt like reminders of a chapter closed too soon. As he stood there, his phone buzzed. It was a message from a former colleague. "You didn't deserve this. History will remember the truth." He appreciated the words, but he knew history wasn't kind to those caught in controversy. It rarely cared about the details. It only remembered the headlines. Later that afternoon, he took a drive through the city. He passed the Bureau building but didn't stop. He didn't need to go inside again. Instead, he went to a quiet cafe on the other side of town, a place he used to visit before life became all meetings and pressure. The same waitress recognized him but said nothing, just offered a polite nod. He ordered coffee and sat by the window listening to the quiet hum of conversation around him. Two men at a nearby table were discussing the news, unaware of who was sitting just a few feet away. "It's crazy," one said. "Imagine being in his shoes." The other shook his head. He should have spoken out sooner. Maybe then people would have seen his side. He smiled faintly to himself. Everyone had a version of what he should have done. In truth, there had never been a perfect choice, only options that would each cost something. Leadership, he realized, was often about which loss you were willing to accept. That evening, he visited his parents' house outside the city. They were older now, both retired, both worried. His mother hugged him tightly when he walked in. "I saw the news," she said softly. "I wish people understood." He smiled gently. "It's all right, Mom. It's done now." His father, always a man of few words, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did your job with honor. That's what matters." They ate dinner together, simple food, quiet conversation. For the first time in weeks, he felt grounded again. The world outside still buzzed with opinions and noise, but here, in this small house filled with old memories, it didn't seem so loud. When he returned home that night, he checked his mail. There was an envelope with no return address. Inside was a short handwritten note. "You showed calm when others wouldn't have. Some of us saw that. Thank you." He read it twice, folded it carefully, and placed it in a drawer. It wasn't much, but it reminded him that not everyone had turned away. Days turned into weeks. Without his title, his days were unstructured. He spent time reading, walking, and writing thoughts in a small notebook. Sometimes he reflected on the events that had changed his life. Other times he tried not to think about them at all. Slowly, the constant ache in his chest began to fade, replaced by quiet acceptance. One morning, a journalist requested an interview. Not about the incident, she said, but about what it means to lose something you built your life around. He hesitated, but eventually agreed. Maybe it was time to speak, not to defend himself, but to help others understand what happens when someone in power is suddenly powerless. The interview took place in a small studio, simple and quiet. She asked gentle questions about leadership, responsibility, and resilience. He spoke honestly, carefully choosing his words. The hardest part, he said, is not the loss of the position. It's realizing how quickly people define you by one moment and how slow they are to see the whole person behind it. The interview aired a few days later. To his surprise, it was well received. People called it thoughtful, calm, and human. Some who had criticized him before now spoke of respect. The tide didn't fully turn, but it shifted slightly, and that was enough. It reminded him that patience, even in the worst storms, still mattered. After that, he began receiving invitations to speak at universities and conferences. Not as a government official, but as someone with perspective. He didn't accept most of them at first, still unsure if he wanted to stand in front of people again. But one invitation caught his attention. A seminar on public service and integrity. It felt fitting. When the day came, he stood before a small audience of students and young professionals. They listened closely as he spoke, not about the incident, but about the values that should outlast any title: honesty, humility, fairness. The measure of a person, he said, isn't how they stand when the world agrees with them. It's how they stand when it doesn't. Afterwards, several students came up to thank him. One young man said quietly, "I didn't know much about what happened, sir. But hearing you today, it makes me want to serve for the right reasons," he smiled. That single comment meant more than any headline or press statement. It meant something good had survived after all. That night, he returned home feeling lighter. He cooked dinner, opened the windows, and let the city sounds drift in. It wasn't the life he had before, but it was a life that still had meaning. He realized that losing a position didn't mean losing purpose. The two were never supposed to be the same. Before going to bed, he opened his notebook and wrote a few lines. The world moves on, but sometimes in losing what we thought defined us, we discover who we really are. He paused, looked at the words, and smiled faintly. They felt true. Outside, the night was quiet. The noise had finally faded. Not because people forgot, but because time had softened the edges. Tomorrow would come, as it always did, and he would face it not as a director, not as a symbol, but simply as a man still learning how to begin again. Months had passed since his resignation, but it still felt strange to wake up without the rush of duty waiting for him. Life had slowed down in a way he hadn't known before. The mornings were quiet, the phone no longer buzzing with endless calls. At first, that silence had felt like failure. Now it felt like recovery. He had started keeping small routines to stay grounded. Every morning he made a cup of black coffee, opened the curtains, and sat by the window for a few minutes before doing anything else. It was his way of resetting, a reminder that even without the noise of leadership, life still moved forward. He spent his afternoons reading or visiting local community centers, where he volunteered to mentor young people interested in public service. At first, they had looked at him with curiosity, whispering quietly about who he used to be. But as time went on, they saw past the headlines and began to listen. He spoke to them about integrity, about how power wasn't the same as purpose. Titles fade, he told them one day, but how you treat people never does. His talks weren't formal or polished anymore. He didn't wear suits or prepare notes. He just spoke honestly, with the kind of calm that comes after surviving a storm. The young people liked that. They said it made him seem real. Outside of his volunteer work, he kept a low profile. Sometimes he visited his parents, helping them with chores or sitting quietly with his father on the porch. His mother still worried about how the world had treated him, but he always told her not to. "What matters," he said one evening as the sun went down, "is that I still believe in what I stood for, even if others don't." One afternoon, he received a letter from a university that had studied the internal response to public controversies. They wanted him to contribute to a new course on ethical decision-making. It wasn't a full-time position, just a guest lecture series, but something about it felt right. He had nothing to prove anymore, and maybe teaching others how to handle moral pressure was the best way to move forward. He accepted. The first lecture was small, maybe 20 students, but he felt the same nervousness he used to feel before big hearings. When he spoke, the room was silent. He didn't talk about himself directly. Instead, he described what it means to face judgment, how to make decisions when the right thing isn't popular. Courage, he said quietly, isn't loud. Most of the time, it's just doing what's right when no one is watching. Afterward, a student approached him and said, "Sir, I read about you before I took this class. But hearing you today made me realize how unfair the world can be, and how important it is not to let it make us bitter." He smiled. "Bitterness is easy," he said. "Grace takes effort. That's why it matters more." Teaching became a quiet joy for him. It gave him purpose again, not the kind tied to authority, but the kind that built something lasting. The students respected him, not for what he had been, but for what he had learned. And in that, he found something deeper than he'd ever known in his career. Still, there were hard days. Sometimes he'd see an old photo of himself in uniform or come across news about the bureau. A part of him missed it, the sense of mission, the clarity of purpose. But he knew he couldn't go back. The world had changed, and so had he. Now his work was not about control, but about understanding. It was about helping others avoid the mistakes he couldn't. One evening, as he walked home from the university, he stopped by a park he used to visit when life felt overwhelming. He sat on a bench, listening to the distant laughter of children and the rustle of leaves. The world was softer now, less demanding. He realized he no longer felt angry or defensive about what had happened. The resentment had slowly drained away, replaced by acceptance. He took out his notebook, the same one he had been writing in since the day he left office, and flipped through the pages. They were filled with thoughts, reflections, questions. Some pages were messy, some neat, some half-finished. Near the end, he wrote a new line. "You cannot control how the world sees you, only how you keep seeing yourself." He underlined it once and closed the book. The next day, an old colleague reached out for the first time in months. The man was retiring soon and wanted to meet for coffee. They met at a quiet cafe downtown away from the crowds. It was awkward at first, old habits and old wounds, but soon they fell into easy conversation. "You know," his colleague said after a while, "the bureau still feels your absence. Things haven't been the same." He smiled faintly. "They're not supposed to be. Every place moves on, and so should we." The man nodded. "You were always better at moving on than most." "I had to learn," he said softly. "The hard way." As they parted, the colleague said, "For what it's worth, a lot of people inside still respect you. They just can't say it out loud." He nodded. "That's enough. I never needed the noise. Just the truth." Walking back to his car, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The respect he had lost publicly still existed privately, and that was enough for him now. Over the following months, he continued teaching, mentoring, and writing. A small publisher reached out about turning his reflections into a book, not a memoir, but a collection of lessons on leadership and humanity. He hesitated at first, unsure if he wanted to reopen old wounds, but then decided it was worth doing if it could help others. The book came out a year later under a modest title. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found an audience among students, teachers, and professionals. Readers said it felt genuine, not preachy. They said it made them think. That was all he had ever wanted. By the second year of his quiet new life, he rarely appeared in the news. The headlines had long moved on. The night that had changed his life had become a small footnote in history, debated by some, forgotten by most. But that was fine with him. What mattered was that he had rebuilt his life with integrity still intact. Sometimes while walking through the city, someone would stop him, a stranger, a former student, a young officer, and say something kind. "Your story made me think," or "I learned from what you went through." Every time he'd nod with gratitude. Those moments reminded him that even painful experiences could carry purpose if handled with grace. One evening, years after it all began, he stood by the window of his home again, coffee in hand, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. He thought about everything that had happened, the pride, the fall, the silence, and the slow rebuilding. It wasn't the path he had imagined, but it was one that had taught him the deepest lessons of his life. He whispered to himself, "Sometimes losing everything helps you see what really matters." And in that quiet room, surrounded by nothing but stillness and memory, he finally felt free, not defined by the title he once held, not haunted by the past, but simply human.